welcome everybody to the I by IMD Book Club. I'm Professor Phil Rosenzweig. I've been at IMD a long time, but I'm here today to host and to speak with my esteemed colleague, Arturo Bris. Many of you probably know Arturo better than you would know me. Arturo wears many hats at IMD. He's professor of finance. He's also the director of the IMD World Competitiveness Center. And so he knows a lot about competitiveness issues, but I must say he has a very, very broad bandwidth. If you have questions about fintech, about blockchain, about cybercurrency, Arturo is your man. But I don't mean to distract you to talk about those things. We're here today to talk about a book that Arturo has written, which has just appeared in 2021 by Routledge. I was going to hold up the cover, but unfortunately it's a blue cover, which means nobody can see it. But the book is called The Right Place: How National Competitiveness Makes or Breaks Companies. And this is an interesting notion because we at IMD work with managers of companies. And of course, our business is to be working with companies so that managers can do a better job. And Arturo, coming from the research they do at the World Competitiveness Center, is saying, in fact, there's a lot of things that go on outside a company which shape its success. So welcome, Arturo. We have a lot of things to talk about. The book is a very rich book, and I'm full of admiration at the work that you and, in fairness, your colleagues as well at the center have done to compile all of what is here. But let's begin just with an opening question by asking you, what's the main idea of the book and why did you write it?
Yes, and thank you, Phil, and a pleasure to be here. You positioned the book extremely well. I mean, I wrote the book being part of a business school, and essentially we work with companies. And the idea behind the book is that when we look at company success, very often, especially in a business school like IMD, we focus too much on aspects of management that are under the control of the leader, be it the company strategy or even your individual leadership skills. But over time, especially at the center, we have realized that there is a high correlation between the quality of the country, measured by certain, what we call competitiveness, and then the success of their companies. It goes in both directions. Successful countries have successful companies, and successful companies make it up for successful countries. But what I wanted to entertain in the book is this idea that being in the right place actually plays probably a more important role in company success or failure than anything else.
Yeah.
And that's what I try to explain.
And so being in the right place is important, but also helping to create the right place is important because what you're able to show is there are things that can be done to make a place a right place. No place is born right, and no place will stay right without certain actions that are done. I think before we talk about some of those elements, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that, I think it is important to be clear on what we mean by competitiveness, because it's a term that can be misunderstood. You use at one point the metaphor of a bicycle. You talk about, you need the road and you need the cycle and you need the cyclist, but you also talk about not just a bicycle, but a bicycle race. And a bicycle race suggests that I'm racing against you, you're racing against me, only one person wins the gold medal. But as I read the book, I thought there was a terrific summary partway through and there are summaries at the end of each chapter, but there was a very good summary on competitiveness. And let me just read it here, because I think the words are very well chosen. It says, competitiveness is best understood as a country's ability to generate prosperity by using all the resources and competencies of its economy. So it's really talking about the way that a country is able to take all these different resources and create the conditions where prosperity can be generated by the private sector, but the public sector plays a great role. And you make the further point, which I think is very important, competitiveness is not a zero-sum game. So it's not like a race where if you finish first, well, the best I can do is second. And if I pass you, then I'm first, then you're second. That's a zero-sum kind of game. But competitiveness is not like that. Can you tell us a bit more so that we have the right understanding and not the wrong one?
Yes, and you make a good point, because I think the metaphor is complete when we say that we're not looking at winning the race, but we're looking at finishing the race.
Okay.
Make it to the end, or at least reach the final goal. The concept of competitiveness has been, of course, worrying us for a long time, and that's very well defined by you, and actually from reading the book, because we already know, we all know what the objective of a government should be. It's like basically to create the conditions for people's prosperity. I think we have been missing for a long time what is the right KPI, because you can actually look at different countries and see which one is more prosperous or not. But we need to provide politicians with tools to manage that, and that's what we do with competitiveness. Competitiveness, as you say, regards the conditions that make a country prosperous,
right?
And that's somehow manageable by political leaders, but also by corporate leaders. And at the end of the day, as you say, it resembles like a Viking race in the sense that you need mainly two ingredients for a competitive country. You need a solid public sector, a good government, and an efficient private sector. The rest, infrastructure, economic conditions, they come around. But these are the two pillars of a competitive country.
And you do mention that the book is written for political leaders and also business leaders. And I'd like to take those one at a time. I'd like to hold off on the business leaders for a bit, but let's make sure we do get to them. Because I think a lot of the book really is talking about things that are done by political leaders, by the public sector, by the participation of large amounts of the population. So you just mentioned things like infrastructure and education. And by the way, let me just also mention to our listeners, the book, it draws on an extraordinary wealth of research done by the World Competitiveness Center, augmented by a lot of personal trips and travels by Arturo. And there are many photographs of Arturo in many parts of the world. It adds a very nice touch. And the countries that are described are not necessarily the ones that might first come to mind or the biggest, but you'll learn about Slovenia and what's happening in Estonia and Argentina and Oman and Bhutan, as well as North Korea and places like Switzerland, the Netherlands, and so forth. So there's a wealth there. And based on all of that, you talk about some pillars that we probably would not be surprised to find on that list. Education, infrastructure. Let's talk a little bit about those pillars and either general concepts or maybe some specific examples. Educational systems, infrastructure, rule of law, corruption. These are some fundamental pillars that are important for competitiveness.
Yes, so first of all, infrastructure and education, they are the most important long-term pillars for a competitive country. This is something that many politicians forget, very often as well because of the political process. In the book, I talk, for example, how in Mexico, a president's tenure cannot be longer than 4 years. So it is impossible, and actually that's the case, that a country like Mexico will ever have a solid education system, because there's nobody with the vision and the long-term commitment to improve education. And the same happens with infrastructure. Okay? But these two pillars are very important. Now, what determines what is a good education system? A good education system is one that fits the needs of the labor market of a country. I know that this is a very partial argument, and many of you will criticize this aspect because it suggests that a country like Switzerland, whose economy is based on technology and on manufacturing, should prepare students only for those jobs, and we should forget about philosophy and law and medical doctors. But that's the way how an education system promotes competitiveness. And of course, to fit the needs of the labor market, you also need the participation of the private sector to bring the voice of the private sector and creating the job that we need. This, for example, what is done in Singapore, where the government listens very well to the private sector, and the private sector says, I need artificial intelligence professionals. The government immediately changes the curriculum. And one final note about education is that the book describes how most of the transformations in education systems that have been successful, Finland, Switzerland, of course, Singapore, Estonia, they are done bottom up. never top down. That is, they start with an agreement by society that education is a pillar for future development. The book spends a lot of time, for example, talking about the educational reform in Finland and how was this was an initiative taken on after the Second World War by a set of institutions in the civil society. Okay. With respect to infrastructure, as to make it brief, I think this is very clear that we need to have good roads and good airports. But it's important to realize that this is not just a question of throwing money into infrastructure by a government. Of course, this is important, but good infrastructures also result from good partnerships between the private and the public sector. We see that now happening, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative by China, where these investments are joint between public and private sector.
Yes. Okay. So education, infrastructure, and in this first list of pillars, we also talk about things like rule of law, corruption, and you talk about talent. Talent, education, they would seem to be very closely related. But maybe by talent, we're talking about attracting talent. Does it have to do with things like immigration policies?
Exactly. That's a very good point. There are two additions. So talent relative to education refers to bringing up talent from abroad and, of course, preventing brain drain.
Yeah.
Also refers to training providing within companies. That is basically education finishes when you graduate from college, but to develop talent, companies also need to promote skills for people in the job, and we refer to these two factors as well.
Okay.
This is an interesting observation as well, because there are countries with relatively good education systems, but whose talent leaves the country. This is the case of Eastern Europe. Ukraine, that you know well as well. Ukraine is a country with an amazing talent. Before the invasion, the problem still was that all the talent that the country is generating leaves. Okay. The founder of Revolut, which is one of the most important fintech disruptors in the banking world, a bank based in London, actually is from Ukraine. Okay, and that's one of the problems with talent, that governments need to, which is very difficult very often, need to make sure that talent remains and that talent is attracted to the country.
Yeah. Okay, good. We're going to talk about this next list in a moment, but before we do that, you, of course, have been spending a lot of time not just researching and presenting, but also perhaps formally or informally advising. And you talk to a lot of government actors who listen to what you suggest here. Where are they surprised? Where are they receptive? Where are they sometimes maybe a little bit hesitant or even resistant?
Yes, obviously, when it comes to money, which is typically the first factor, very many politicians are surprised when you tell them that if you want to have a good education system, you need to invest in education. Okay, very often, I think regulators focus too much on the curriculum, or they focus too much on the regulatory environment. I didn't realize that this is all about money at the end of the day. Okay. The other thing that is very often surprising by policymakers is that when they realize that they need to count on the private sector as well.
Yeah.
They have to collaborate much more than they need to listen, and it has to go both ways. Also, the private sector needs to be more collaborative with the government.
Okay. And that leads us very nicely into maybe the next area to talk about, because when you talk about the need for this collaboration, public sector, private sector, respect on both sides, understanding they have a vital role to play, it brings us to a next series of points that are maybe less obvious, but they include, and let me just mention a few, and then I'd like you to go into depth on them. You talk about a national strategy. If you have a national strategy, you might be able to forge that kind of consensus. If you don't have one, harder to do. But you talk about the importance of a national strategy. You talk about branding. That's an interesting idea, branding at the country level. You talk about political consensus. So again, this idea that if we're going to have a competitive nation, we've got to have people that are all really pulling in the same direction. Let's begin with the idea of national strategy. What that means, we're used to talking about strategy in a business sense, in an industry of competition, perhaps. What does it mean in a national sense? And the example that you give is of Japan and what it's been able to do. Tell us a bit about a national strategy.
When we received the first delegation from Japan at the center, maybe it was like 6-7 years ago. I mean, the first delegation when I was already the director, I remember that it was a big delegation of Japanese senior officials that they wanted to come to us to present everything that at that time the government of Shinzo Abe was doing. So we asked them, like, can you present to us what is the economic strategy of Japan? And I still remember, because they were all, as you can imagine, very nice. And they basically put together one slide and we said, is that your presentation? And they said, yes. Basically, they showed one slide on the screen and then it says, Japan Economic Revitalization Strategy. Actually, that slide I reprinted in the book. And that was a discovery, because when we apply business principles to governments, which is what I try to do in the book, coming from a business school, very often that you see that companies fail because they don't have a strategy, and what is even worse, they cannot explain it.
Yeah.
And I use the example of Japan because, on the contrary, if you look at many other countries, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, if you look at their country strategies, they are basically like millions of documents. Saudi Vision 2030, I think it would be extremely difficult to summarize because it's extremely complicated. So having a good strategy for a country, first of all, means that the country has to make choices.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to surprise you.
Yeah.
You're a professor of strategy. You know what we teach our executives. You need to make choices, which basically means that you also need to decide what you are not going to do. Okay. Today, all countries want to be digital. Okay. Well, maybe it's not for some countries, because if you're purely manufacturing, you may need to focus on something else. Today, all countries want to be exporting economies. Well, again, maybe that's not your strength. Okay. So making choices is very important. The second aspect of a strategy is that they have to have a long-term view. And here, the book spends a lot of time explaining that this is the biggest problem in democracies today. That there are no economic strategies in countries like France or Brazil because the democratic process makes it extremely difficult. That's unfortunately the beauty of good dictatorships. Okay? Yep. Singapore can have a long-term strategy because they know that they're going to be there to implement it. And I actually in the book explain some exceptions to the rule. For example, we spoke about the famous Boston mayor that was interestingly transformative for the city of Boston because of the political process in Boston where the mayor is chosen in a non-partisan process. That is, the mayor doesn't need to belong to a party. So you can actually have processes embedded into democracy that create a long-term vision. The best example here is Switzerland. I mean, in Switzerland, the political process is such that the main consensus are always taken into account for the very long term. So irrespective of who wins the election, because of the way how the government, the federal council is structuring, where you have 7 members that typically belong to many different parties, then they're going to always do something similar over time.
You've said a lot here about national strategy. Let me just try to summarize a few points. One thing is that you said there is a clear strategy, but I think implicit in what you said is that if we talk to many people from different parts of Japan, they would produce the same slide. There's an agreement on it. So it's not enough that I have it on one slide. It's that it doesn't matter who we talk to, we're all aligned with that, which I think is a very important thing. And that related to that, there are choices that have to be made. We're going to do some things, not do others. But one of the things that's important for a company to do, and I think you're saying also a country, is that the choices we make have to take into account the choices that others are making, because we can't all do everything. And so you do need to look around and say, Well, in what fields, in what industries, in what functions do we have something special to draw upon? Can you give an example of a company that perhaps through its examination of other countries and of what others were doing made a choice to go this way versus that way in terms of a national strategy?
Yes, and again, that's a key aspect of a successful strategy, to be able to differentiate.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, I talk about some. For example, all the industrial transformation that has happened in Southeast Asia, but also South Korea, in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Philippines, have actually done that better or worse. That is, you have good and bad examples. South Korea and Taiwan, for example, after the Second World War, decided to specialize. In the case of South Korea, in intensive industries such as steel and automotive. In the case of Taiwan, in semiconductors.
Mm-hmm.
And this specialization was the success of those strategies. A country like Thailand, for example, didn't do that in principle. And they tried to follow, they tried to copy, and they said, we also want to manufacture cars. Okay? Now I challenge you to name a South Korean car brand. And I'm sure that you tell me at least two. Okay? Maybe because you are a very well-traveled man as well, you can name a famous Thai car brand.
I think I can name South Korean, but probably not Thai, yeah?
Yeah, and that's the result of Thailand investing a lot in the industry, but realizing that it was not a big differentiator, especially in the market. Another example that I saw in the book is, for example, when it comes to Estonian technology. Estonia, which is a country that now has become a poster child of digital transformation, was a country that started from scratch after the fall of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And because of a series of circumstances, which are interesting to discuss, by the way, then the country decided to focus on technology and digital transformation. Mm-hmm. And is now one of the most digitally advanced nations of the world.
But even when you say the country decided, what's implicit there is that there is a consensus, a political consensus that allows not only a decision to be taken, but for the governmental authorities to persist in that over time. Because as you say, if every 4 years we're shifting back and forth. So that brings us to what we talk about as political consensus. And I think this idea of national strategy and political consensus seem to go well together. Can you tell us anything there? Because I would imagine there where when you're talking with with countries, with government officials, they may say, Arturo, this sounds very interesting, but we have a political system that doesn't foster this convergence, this consensus. Our institutions might not foster this in a way that we would like. What are some of those conversations like?
And it's true. And you see the world today moving in these two directions. One direction is, I'm going to do what people want. That's pure populism. And the other solution is, you know what? Let me ignore what people want and let me do what I think is right. That's, for example, France, and what Macron did before the election when he became a president. Okay, that typically leads to failure because Macron tried to reform the pension system in France and he failed. And when you do what people truly want, you actually end up doing not the right thing, probably not what people need. So political consensus boils down to, first of all, conveying the right message to the population, doing the right thing, and showing leadership to convince society that it's the right course of action, and of course listening to people as well, and walking the talk. There are countries that have built consensus over time. Again, here the case of Switzerland comes to mind. But there are other countries, in the book I talk about Lithuania, where political leaders, by making what goes right, even at the expense of their own political careers, they managed to create this political consensus. That is, society realized that this was the right thing to do.
Yeah. So in a sense, things like education, infrastructure, as important as they are, they're going to be possible if we have a vision, a strategy, a consensus, and maybe we will not make progress on them if we don't. So if you want to know where to begin, it really has to do more with the vision that you have, the strategy, and the consensus that brings it to bear.
Yes.
There's a few others on your list here. You talk about branding. What do you mean by branding at a country level as it relates to competitiveness?
Very early in the job, when I took over as director of the center, we conducted a research project where what we're trying to find is what is the best predictor of a country's competitiveness. This was based on questions from our institutes and our partners and government that wanted to know, well, if I have to think about one important aspect of my economy, what should it be? And then we did an econometric analysis. And actually what we found is that the best predictor of a country's competitiveness in the long run is the image of the country abroad. Okay? The single one that drives everything else.
Yep.
When the country has a good image, it attracts capital, people invest, jobs are created, employees pay taxes, the government build infrastructure and invest in education, which in fact reinforces the brand of the country.
Yeah.
So I went on a journey to actually look at how countries manage their brands, because you also teach marketing in a business school. And then you realize that this has become extremely important in the recent years, because essentially you create your differentiation by branding the country in a particular way. Okay? I give you one example. When it comes to Thailand, for example, Thailand is an economy whose GDP depends to a great extent on tourism. More than 16% of Thai GDP come from tourist receipts. However, in the early days, the tourism that was coming to Thailand was essentially about backpackers and sexual tourism. It was low class or low reputation tourism. So the country started a very important branding program where they emphasize two ideas. First of all, natural beauty. You want to come to Thailand to enjoy the beauty of the country. And second, food, because Thai food was considered one of the best in the world. And actually, if you look at what has happened after that, Thai food has been appreciated much more. By the way, Peru did exactly the same.
Yeah.
Peru's approach to branding has been exactly the same. But in the book, I talk about a country like South Africa, engaging in branding strategies, or East Timor, countries that have actually market their brands as countries, and actually they have been proven extremely successful. Okay? There is no country nowadays that doesn't advertise itself. Not advertising, come to Thailand as a tourist. They promote their countries from the economic standpoint.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I'm looking at the clock. We're about halfway through. There's a number of things we still want to cover. I want to ask you some questions about a few large countries in particular. I want to talk about implications for business leaders, and I want to leave time for any kind of chat. We haven't talked about this, but there should be a chat function. Are you so for our participants, are you able to write questions? And if so, we'll ask Arturo to monitor those, and perhaps later on we'll come to that. So if there are questions you have as we're going for the live audience, please feel free to do that. Before we move on to implications for business leaders, there's a couple large countries that I want to make sure we talk about before any more time goes on. It's fine to talk about Thailand and South Korea, Lithuania, Estonia, and so forth. But there's two big ones that we haven't talked about, which I think are very interesting for very different reasons. One's the United States and one's China. Let me talk a little bit about the United States. So I'm an American. I haven't lived there for a long time, but I still follow it very closely. And in the World Competitiveness rankings, the United States often is rated as most competitive, or sometimes very close to the top. But when I look at the various elements, education, well, I think probably fantastic higher education, but I think basic education is very, very iffy, but has been very good at attracting talent. And we still have been a magnet for immigrants. Yet, when I visit there now, I think our infrastructure is way behind so many other parts of the world. So it's a very mixed kind of a report card. Healthcare as well. We spend an enormous amount of our gross national product on healthcare, but it's not obvious that the results are that much better. And when it comes to political consensus, well, I think maybe 30 years ago or 50 years ago, there was much more of a political consensus. I'm holding my hands this way to suggest that there was not that much variance. Now we're kind of way over here. So it's an odd mix. But then when you talked about branding, and I'm not sure there's an explicit branding that the United States does, but when you say how you are perceived from abroad, that I think is extremely powerful. There's this soft power and cultural power. So I look at the US, and on a lot of the things that you're talking about, I see very great variance in where it stands. What can you tell us about the United States now? And
Yes.
what can, if you were advising the United States on its competitiveness, what would you tell it at this point?
Yes. So, and you explained that well. The lack of consensus and the fragmentation of society also explains why in the last years the United States has been falling in the rankings. It used to be number one for almost every year. Now, still remains in the top 5, but is becoming lower. So let me also come to the rescue of your country.
Okay.
Because of what you say. When it comes to education, interestingly, the United States invests way more than the average in education relative to GDP. And I'm talking about public sector investment. Okay, this is not also primary education, but also, as you say, high schools and universities. And as a result of that, the performance of students in the United States in the labor market is not that bad. I must also say that what I said earlier, the match between education system and job opportunities for graduates is very good in the United States.
It's very good. You think it's good?
Yeah, relatively speaking. That is
okay. Good.
There is no. It is easy to be employed in the United States with a university degree relative to any other country.
Okay.
When it comes to infrastructure, you are right, but I always use the US because you need to realize that when we talk about infrastructure, we don't refer only to physical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
For us, and now even more, what is important as well is the intangible infrastructure. For example, the digital and technology infrastructure, which in the United States is, again, one of the top when it comes to internet connection and digital connectivity, mobile lines, and so on.
And would you also put, when you talk about intangible infrastructure, would you also put, for example, the efficiency of capital markets?
Not
that somewhere else?
Not really. That is somewhere else. That actually builds the efficiency of the private sector, which, by the way, is also very important in the United States. Finally, the US has a very peculiar model of competitiveness. So it's very unique because it's the biggest importer in the world economy. It has built a competitive model by having consumers. It's a country of consumers. People buy everything, and this consumption generates jobs and then generates income, and subsequently is very difficult to copy as a model. What are the major challenges of the United States today? I think they don't have much to do with economic performance, relatively speaking, or with the quality of the private sector. I think they have to do with 2 issues. One is the structure of the government and the inefficiency of the government. In essence, in the United States, the private sector pulls the public sector, but the public sector is inefficient, not very well structured, corrupted to some extent at different levels, and then it doesn't satisfy the needs of society. And the second problem is inequality and social imbalances. You have very successful companies and very successful individuals in the US, but the social gap is huge and higher than anywhere. And I think that should be the main problem to resolve right now.
That leads me, Arturo, to ask a question. I'm going to ask it in the context of the US, but it's really not a US question. And that is the level of analysis that we talk about. The level of analysis you're dealing with here is the country. But if you look at the United States, you say, well, if I'm looking at the West Coast and the East Coast, it looks very different than certain parts of the country that are I'd say at a different level of competitiveness. And I believe in the past, sometimes even at the WCC in India, you might have looked at Maharashtra compared to other parts of the country, or you might have looked in China at some of the coastal regions versus others that were very populous, but not as far along. So the question that it poses is, is it always helpful to talk at the national level, or sometimes does that obscure some important differences that are better examined at a regional or subnational level?
Yeah, you're right. Obviously, the US cannot be considered as a single economic unit, and that's a problem. Okay, I think we're going to be transitioning over time and over the years into an IMD World Competitiveness Center that will study economic regions or cities.
Okay.
I mean, formally, actually, today we rank economies, not countries. That's why we have Hong Kong, okay, or Taiwan, that are not considered countries by international standard. But so and that's a sensitive.
Taiwan's going to be an interesting one there, but yes. Anyway, we'll let that go. Yeah. Okay.
But you are right. I think we already do other studies of cities. We have a ranking of smart cities.
Yeah.
That were now have been publishing for the last 4 years. And you are right that we need to focus much more on smaller economic units, because it's very difficult to just give a uniform picture.
Well, I'm not saying you should. I mean, you'll know it better than I. But for example, you do spend time about the efficacy and the success of the city government in Boston and Greater Boston, but there isn't the equivalent at the national level. Of course, Mayor Menino was in charge for about 20 years and was able to do some things with other like-minded people to forge a consensus. Let's move briefly to China, and I think this is an interesting point of comparison, because many people would say, well, it's arguably the biggest economy in the world, depending how you measure it, or maybe the second biggest, soon to be the biggest, we'll see. But according to the way you look at it, in many ways, it's not as highly rated in competitiveness as some people might imagine. Tell us a bit about how we should think about China and how we should think about it going forward.
That's one of the major criticisms that we get at the center. So people say, how can you tell me that China is not one of the top 10 most competitive economies in the world? It ranks number 12, by the way. And the answer is that there are some confusions about China. First of all, it's true that China is, if not the largest, close to becoming the largest economy in the world. Now, on a per capita basis, if you try to measure individual prosperity, China is an average country. Okay? It is true that has been improving, and it's also true that has been climbing the competitiveness ladder and our ranking. On a per capita basis, it's just an average country. It's a very large economy. So when you look at absolute magnitudes of performance, the economy looks extremely successful. The second confusion is that when people think China, but have you been to Xiamen? Have you been to Shanghai? And have you been, to Shenzhen? They say yes, but China is not just, as you said, the eastern part. Actually, the vast majority of the Chinese population lives in the inland, and in some areas of China, you don't have access to any technology or any internet, for example.
Yeah.
So when you look at the average Chinese, which is very difficult to look at, but on the overall, China is not a very successful economy. Now, a different thing would measure the competitiveness of Shanghai. Okay, it would be probably a different case.
Yeah, if you look at Shanghai, if you look at the greater area around Guangzhou and Shenzhen and places like that. But you're right. I mean, I'll tell you a story. Some years ago, I was teaching in China, and I was just casually talking to some of the students. Oh, where are you from? They said, I'm from, they mentioned a province, not one of the better known provinces. And the person said, not very big province, only 60 million people. And you think, my gosh, that's as big as any country in Europe. But to them, it was not that big. And you begin to understand just the magnitude. I think it's fair to say, and as you pointed out, in terms of lifting people out of poverty, it's done an extraordinary job. But if you look at the average, okay, we've still got a bit of time, but I want to move on now to business leaders, because you say the book is also for business leaders, although a lot of it is saying the right place. So I've got a few questions for you. What would you say are the implications for business leaders? And a follow-on to that, it could be that it's understanding what makes today's place a better place and how I can work with the public sector to make this place better. But if you're managing a multinational firm, you also have choices about where in the world to set up a next factory, a next subsidiary. Do we even see managers or business leaders shifting the geographic profile of the country, of the countries in which they operate? So it's a two-pronged question: improving this place, but also evolving what places we're in.
Yeah, and let me make three points or recommendations about that. The first one, as you say, is that international executives and executives in global companies, they need to realize that tracking the quality of the countries where they operate is very important. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then it is not the same as operating in Argentina as it is in Jordan. And you need to take those into account when you set up your footprint. Notice that this doesn't refer only to where I set up my factories, but also the markets that you target, where I sell my product. Okay, mm-hmm. So it will probably today much better, much easier to sell your product in Singapore than it will be in Nigeria. Obviously, for these considerations have to be taken into account. The second one is closely related, is that, and I emphasize that in the book a lot, I think a very important skill for successful leaders today is resilience to the environment. That is understanding what is going on. Okay. Very often you work with executives that when you talk about water scarcity or you talk about what is happening in Ukraine, they say, I couldn't care less. You know, I'm a banker in Chile. Why should I care about water scarcity? Or why should I care about Ukraine? Okay. That's a big mistake. Okay, because I think executives need to realize that a very important factor of success is the global environment, and understanding at least and being able to measure is important. And finally, something that you suggest, very often I think executives and leaders underestimate their ability to implement change. Mm-hmm. So a big aspect of change management is to what extent you can shape policies mm-hmm. and you can change government actions. Mm-hmm. That's something that is obviously much easier to do in smaller countries. Mm-hmm. Okay, then Denmark is paradise for that. In Denmark, everything that happens at the policy level is shaped by the interest of leaders in civil society or in business. But very often executives underestimate it. And one of our colleagues, David Bach, has shown that today customers and shareholders want their senior executives to speak up about important issues. Mm-hmm. And this is the case because their opinion matters for policy making. So mm-hmm. today customers, when I buy a product, I want that the CEO of that company has a particular opinion about Ukraine mm-hmm. or a particular opinion about policies in their country. And that ability to influence should also be taken into account.
Yeah, and I think that also leads us to some things in the latter part of the book, which is about the future of competitiveness and some of these issues around climate change, around sustainability. There's, I think, an expectation on the part of the public, on the part of consumers and employees, that business plays a more active role, but that active role can also shape the government agenda and the public actions. But I think that probably happens in some countries better than others. You say in Denmark, that seems to happen quite well.
Yes.
Do you have other examples of either where that's beginning to change or improving, or lessons that we can learn?
Yes. So I think that there are two types countries where you see the private sector being much more proactive in politics, or at least in decision making. Again, Switzerland is a good country. Thailand, there is countries where the politicians, they listen to corporate executives. Thailand is interesting because essentially the current government has been set up by the business, essentially. Okay, but there are some others, on the contrary, and these are the examples that I want to use, where political leaders are probably for political reasons totally deaf to the needs of the business sector. Okay, I'm talking about Brazil or Venezuela, for example, and this is a recipe for disaster. Okay, it's not because we want to promote capitalism that we need to listen to corporate executives. It's because they bring very proactively the voice of civil society.
So a message that I'm hearing is a lot of listening, a lot of conferring, and a lot of partnership, and partnership going in both directions. And that the countries where that seems to be working the best are ones that are able to take actions, achieve a consensus, articulate a vision, and then be able to implement these. I think we have at least one question. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So there are two questions in the chat.
Yeah, good. Let's respond to those then.
So in your opinion, what are the major challenges that India faces in improving its economy? Thank you for asking. Actually, in the book, I devote a few pages to India, and I will just mention two big challenges. One is brain drain, obviously. I mean, whoever has been to India realizes the amazing talent pool in the country and how sadly this talent pool tends to leave. But less obvious, I think one of the major problems at India has been the underdevelopment of its financial system. I mean, if you look at the main differentiator between China and India when it comes to the performance of these two countries in the last 2 years, is the importance of the banking sector. In China, the banking sector was very well reformed. You have very important banks and institutions that are financing the development. In India, because of history, the banking sector was nationalized and now is a disaster. And that, if I were in charge of any policy in India, that would be an aspect that I would emphasize immediately: the development of the financial sector.
I spent a bit of time with one of the leading private banks there, and I learned a lot about how there had been such a low penetration of things like mortgages, loans for motorcycles, credit cards, things like that. I know that it's changed quite a bit, but in your view, still has a long, long way to go.
Oh yes. I mean, it's going to take one generation, this transformation. I think Raghuram Rajan, which is one of the most famous financial economists in the US and who took over as president of the Bank of India 10 years ago for some time, had this as one of his priorities. And I think he initiated this transformation. But it's going to take a long time.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Norbert is asking, in your opinion, how must the EU as economic bloc reposition itself to avoid becoming a ground zero for Russian aggression and to secure attracting talent and capital for life quality and innovation? Well, my opinion about Europe in the context of the war is that actually we have shown the importance, the relevance, and also the agreement that we have within the European Union. This is a success story. I mean, despite the tragedy of war, I think Europe has done, and the European Union has done, extremely well. Obviously, the main challenge that we'll have now is to manage our energy independence. But other than that, now this war is going to set a new border, and this new border is going to be marked by the political system. That's something that we are actually currently analyzing, and we're going to publish an article very soon with some of my colleagues at the center, where we show that if you look at how the world is divided today, is between democracies and the rest. Okay, the only ones who have opposed Russia vehemently are basically democracies. Okay, countries like, for example, Singapore or Saudi Arabia voted with Russia in the United Nations. So basically, this means that Europe is going to remain an island of democracy with a very important border, in our east, which is going to be Russia, and hopefully not Ukraine, but maybe Belarus. And I think democracy is going to be our big differentiator, and what comes with it, particularly sustainability, technology, prosperity. So I see very, very, very bright future for Europe.
Do you worry about any other countries after the UK deciding to leave?
No, as you may know, we talked about that in the past. I was always in favor of Brexit, very happy with Brexit. And in fact, time has proven me right. I think Brexit was extremely beneficial for the European Union, particularly because it has increased the cohesion within the Union. Of course, we may have some dissenting members like Hungary and Poland, but at the social level, the acceptance of the European Union has significantly increased. So no, I don't expect that the European Union will be downsized. Quite the opposite.
Okay.
We need to integrate Ukraine.
Well, thank you for answering those questions. And if there's more, you may let me know and respond to those. But let me come back now and ask you. Early on, we talked about whether competitiveness is first place, second place, is it a ranking, or is victory actually finishing the race? But I do know that there have been some companies that will say, "Ooh, we're falling in the rankings." And sometimes I think there's some interesting conversations to say you're actually improving in absolute terms,
yes,
although maybe falling in relative terms, or the other way around. You've gone up in relative terms, but don't congratulate yourselves too much. There's still a lot you can do in absolute terms. Can you tell us anything about those conversations? I'm not asking for any particular countries, but how government officials should think about improvement in absolute terms versus the ranking, which is a forced relative ranking.
Yes, and this is one of our biggest nightmares. Like for some governments, falling up in the ranking by 1 or 2 positions is a tragedy. Okay, and we always say the same. First of all, this is a ranking, so take into account that this doesn't take into account absolute changes in prosperity. For example, we're about to publish the 2022 World Competitiveness Rankings. We know that the average prosperity in the world has fallen because of COVID and now because of the war. We're not going to capture that in our ranking, because our ranking ranks everybody, and so it will be possible that a country that improves in the ranking still is actually suffering from worse prosperity. But what we tell the government that come to us and our friends when they ask us about that is that the ranking should only be a reference, and if anything, look at how you perform over time. Okay? The ranking should give you a benchmark. The ranking should tell you which country looks alike and which country you should look at. But don't fire a minister, and we have seen that happening. Don't fire a minister if one of your rankings falls. And don't celebrate a party if your ranking increases by 1 position. It's just very important to understand. I must say that thanks to our partner institutes and the government where we work, I think there's now a better understanding of what underpins our ranking.
Good.
And rather than focusing on the absolute number, politicians, they focus on what is behind, on the drivers of the ranking.
Right. Good. We have just a few minutes left, but I think at this point, maybe there's another question to answer. And if not, what are the final takeaways you would like to make sure that audiences have? I hope many will be motivated to find the book. I'm going to hold it up and you won't be able to see it because it's the wrong color. But there we go. Hey, where was it? It was there a moment ago. So it's called The Right Place, How National Competitiveness Makes or Breaks Companies. And the image on the cover are 2 chairs. One has got 4 solid legs and one's got 3 good legs and one that's broken, which means if you sit on the chair, you're going to fall over. So where you sit, where you're located makes a difference. And I guess if we extend the metaphor, how to make sure the chair that we're sitting on is a stable one. What sort of takeaways would you want to leave our audience with today, Arturo? Whether they're business leaders or whether they're people who are directly working with the public sector or in the public sector, who are still all bound up in the prosperity and the mutual work of our countries, what lessons would you like to make sure we leave with?
Yes, I think first of all, the book is a manual for politicians. That is something that we were asked for. Okay, whenever we went to countries to present competitiveness, they would always tell us, "Well, can you give us a guidance?" So I wanted to write the guidance. That's why you have all of these specific chapters that tell you how you deal with every aspect of competitiveness and what are the success cases. Okay, so I wanted to have it as a reference that hopefully all politicians should have in their bookshelf. But for business leaders, I think it's a text that should provide understanding. First of all, understanding on how we measure the success of a country, which is the first part of the book. We need to forget about GDP per capita and other metrics. I think the book explains very well how we should measure the success of a country. And second, it raises this awareness about the importance of the global environment.
Yes.
And then realizing where you are. And then realizing that very often your success may be much more explained by the country where you are operating. And then you have a social responsibility to that country.
And there's empirical evidence early in the book where you say, there's this wonderful chart where you've got concentric circles, and what the manager can do is only one piece and not even the biggest piece, which is a sobering lesson for a lot of us who work in business, because that's really what we have control over. But I think part of the message is you may have direct control over what happens in your company, but indirectly you can do a lot to influence what's going on in the public sector and in society. And that has an enormous bearing on the shared prosperity and the ability for a country to be competitive.
Exactly.
Very good. Are there any further questions as we wrap up? Any last thoughts? Arturo, there's photographs of you in Bhutan, in North Korea, in Argentina. I don't even want to ask how many air miles you've logged, but you obviously enjoyed this. Just any personal reflections from your many years now working on this topic? Any insights, any stories, any personal reflections you'd like to share as we wrap up?
Yes, it's very important to open your eyes. I mean, I'm sure you have the same experience, but many of the stories in the book happen because I had this mindset that let me collect actually experiences. And then once you have your eyes open, you really see amazing things. You remember the story that I tell in the book about taxi drivers in Peru, and the usage of the seatbelt. That was an observation that led to an interesting research about that. But I think my advice is that everywhere we go, we can learn. There's a lot to learn, and we pay attention to the detail.
Yeah, and asking the questions and being open to that experience. Very good. Well, we're just out of time here, so I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us, Arturo. And there will be, I think, a summary, articles, and also that will come from this that we'll post on the website, on the I by IMD as well. We should record this so that people can look at it. And Arturo, you said that the next edition, the 2022 edition of the yearbook is coming out soon. When will that be coming out?
My colleagues are going to kill me because I think the exact date is June 16th, but I may be wrong. Mid-June. Okay.
So soon. It's coming soon, and I'm sure there will be for all of the IMD community word about that as it appears. So again, congratulations on a wonderful book. I recommend it highly and hope that people will look at it. I think it is important to understand, as you said, it was written in a sense as a reference manual for people in the public sector, but many implications for the private sector as well. So let's leave it there. Phil Rosenzweig with Arturo Bris, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Arturo, for a wonderful job.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.